According to egalitarianism, the wealth produced by a society must be distributed fairly. On this view, it is unjust for some people to earn 15 or 50 or 100 times as much income as others. But laissez-faire capitalism, egalitarians say, permits and encourages these disparities in income and wealth, and is therefore unjust. So society must redistribute wealth. Now, the difference in these two conceptions of social justice is the difference between absolute and relative levels of well-being. The theory of welfare rights says that people must have access to a certain minimum level of standard of living. As long as they have that minimum level, according to this theory, it doesn't matter how far others may rise in their income or wealth. They are primarily concerned with programs that benefit people below a certain level of poverty. Egalitarians are concerned with relative well-being. The egalitarians have often said that of two societies, they would prefer the one in which wealth is more evenly distributed, even if the overall standard of living is lower. Better people should be more equal than that some should have more than others. So egalitarians favor government measures such as progressive income tax, which aim to redistribute wealth across the entire income scale, not merely at the bottom. Now, I'm going to discuss these two theories of social justice separately, but I will show that they rest ultimately on the same ethical principle. But I think it's interesting to see how the same principle is at work in the two branches of social justice. The fundamental concept of welfare, of the theory of welfare rights, is that people have rights to goods such as food, shelter, and medical care. That is, on this theory, people are entitled to these things. On this assumption, someone who receives benefits from a government program is merely getting what is due to him, in the same way that a buyer who receives a good he has paid for is merely getting his due. When the state dispenses welfare benefits on this theory, it is merely protecting rights, just as it is when the state protects a buyer against fraud. In neither case is there any necessity for gratitude. The concept of welfare rights, or positive rights as they are often called, is modeled on the traditional liberal rights of life, liberty, and property. In the famous United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, both kinds of rights are included together with no distinction. But in fact, there is a well-known distinction. The liberal rights are rights to act without interference from others. For example, the right of free speech is a right to speak without being prevented by someone else who wants to stop you from saying what is on your mind. But this right does not give you the right to have other people listen if they are not interested in what you have to say. The right of free speech doesn't mean that you will be able to afford a lecture hall. It just means the government cannot stop you. So the traditional liberal rights impose on other people only the negative obligation not to interfere with you, not to restrain you forcibly from acting as you choose. By contrast, welfare rights are conceived as rights to possess and enjoy certain goods regardless of one's actions. They are rights to have the goods provided by others, even if one cannot earn them oneself. Therefore, welfare rights impose positive obligations on other people. If I have a right to food, then someone has an obligation to grow the food. If I cannot pay for the food, someone has an obligation to buy it for me. Now, the people who advocate welfare rights sometimes argue that the obligation is imposed on society as a whole, not on any particular individual. But society is not an entity. It is not a moral agent over and above its individual members. So any obligation that society has falls on us as individuals. Insofar as welfare rights are implemented through government programs, for example, the obligation is distributed over all taxpayers. From an ethical standpoint, therefore, the essence of welfare rights is the premise that the need of one individual is a claim on other individuals. The claim that it is imposed on you by someone else's need does not depend, according to this theory, on your personal relationship to that person. It does not depend on your choice to help. It does not depend on your evaluation of that person as worthy of your help. It is an unchosen obligation arising from the sheer fact of his need. But we need to carry the analysis one step further. If I am living alone on a desert island, then of course I have no welfare rights, for there is no one around to provide the goods. For the same reason, if I live in a primitive society where medicine is unknown, then I have no right to medical care. The content of welfare rights is relative to the level of economic wealth and productive capacity in a given society. And in the same way, the obligation of individuals to satisfy the needs of others is dependent on their ability to do so. I cannot be blamed as an individual for failing to provide others with something that I cannot produce myself. But now suppose I can produce it and simply choose not to. Suppose I am capable of earning a much larger income than I do, and being an academic, I hope that's true, an income where the taxes would support a person who will otherwise go hungry. Am I obliged to work harder, to earn more, for the sake of that person? Well, I don't know any philosopher of welfare rights who would say that I am obliged. The moral claim imposed on me by another person's need is contingent not only on my ability, but also on my willingness to produce. Now, in one way, this is very good. It means the welfare rights theory does not regard me as a slave. But in another way, it reveals something not so good. It reveals that the focus of welfare rights is not really the need of those who have them, or are said to have them, but rather the constraints that are imposed on those who produce the goods that are being distributed. If you value the satisfaction of human needs, then in all logic, you must value the activity of producing what we need, the activity of creating wealth by overcoming the obstacles that nature places in our way. The theorists of welfare rights seem strangely indifferent to this activity of production. They often have looked with yearning on more primitive communitarian societies with lower standards of living and shorter life expectancies, because in those societies, at least, those who did survive benefited from help from the tribe. I believe the moral essence of the theory of welfare rights is not the satisfaction of need per se. It does not assert an obligation to pursue the satisfaction of need, much less an obligation to succeed. The obligation is conditional. Those who do succeed in creating wealth may do so only on condition that others are allowed to share their wealth. The goal is not so much to benefit the needy as to bind the able. It is a philosophy which says that ability, intelligence, initiative, ambition are liabilities that impose on you special obligations not possessed by others. Now, if we turn to egalitarianism, we find that we arrive at the same principle by a different logical route. The ethical framework of the egalitarian is defined by the concept of justice rather than rights. Egalitarians rarely speak about rights. If we look at society as a whole, they say, we see that income, wealth, and power are distributed in a certain way. The basic question is the existing distribution fair? If not, then it must be corrected by government programs of redistribution. A pure market economy, of course, does not produce equality among individuals. But very few egalitarians have claimed that strict equality of outcome, equality of result, as we were discussing earlier this afternoon, is the ideal. For example, the English writer R.H. Tawney wrote that inequality of circumstance is reasonable insofar as it is a necessary condition of securing the services which the community requires. In the same way, more recent theorists, the American writer John Rawls, proposed what he called the difference principle, according to which differences in income and wealth are permissible only so long as they serve the interests of the least advantaged people in society. In other words, virtually all egalitarians, not all, I know some exceptions, but virtually all egalitarians recognize that strict leveling would have a disastrous effect on production. They admit that not everyone contributes equally to production, to the wealth of a society. To some extent, therefore, they say, people must be rewarded, they must be given incentives in accordance with their productive ability, as an incentive to put forth the efforts they are capable of. But any such differences must be limited to those which are necessary for the public good. Why? What is the philosophical basis of that principle? Well, egalitarians often argue that it follows logically from the basic principle of justice. The basic principle is that people are to be treated differently only if they differ in some morally relevant way. Now, we discussed this principle in the previous session. Professor Wolfers-Berger identified the principle, and in my comments, I noted that the reasons why it could not be applied to distribution, so I will just summarize quickly here. In order to apply that principle, that basic principle of justice, to issues of distribution, you must assume that society engages in some act of distribution, but it does not. In a market economy, incomes are determined by the choices of millions of individuals, consumers, investors, entrepreneurs, workers. These choices are coordinated by the laws of supply and demand. So it is no accident, for example, that a successful entrepreneur earns more than a day laborer. But there is no one person who pays the entrepreneur and who pays the day laborer. In 1989, the most highly paid entertainer in the United States was Michael Jackson, who earned $65 million. Why? It was not because society decided that Michael Jackson was worth $65 million. It was because millions of fans of Michael Jackson each decided that his albums were worth whatever they cost. Even in a socialist economy, as we now know, economic outcomes are not under the control of central planners. Even in socialism, there is a kind of spontaneous order, although it is a corrupt one, in which outcomes are determined by bureaucratic infighting, black markets, theft, and so forth. So we must abandon this picture of a giant pie which is being distributed and must therefore be distributed fairly. Once we do abandon this picture, what is left of the principle put forward by Tawney and Rawls and others? The principle that inequalities are acceptable only if they serve the interests of all. If this cannot be grounded in justice, then it must be regarded as a matter of the obligations we bear to each other as individuals. And when we consider it in this light, we can see that it is the same principle that we identified at the basis of the theory of welfare rights. The principle is that the productive may enjoy the fruits of their efforts only on condition that their efforts benefit others as well. There is no obligation to produce, to create, to earn an income, but if you do, the needs of others arise as a constraint on your actions. Your ability, your initiative, your intelligence, your dedication to your goals, and all the other qualities that make success possible are personal assets that put you under an obligation to those with less ability, initiative, intelligence, or dedication. In other words, every form of social justice rests on the assumption that individual ability is a social asset. And I might add that the philosopher John Rawls is quite explicit about this. He says that the principle he believes in represents an effort on the part of all of us to regard each other's personal talents, personal assets, as a collective resource. This assumption is not merely that the individual must respect the rights of the less able, and it is not merely to say that kindness or generosity are virtues. It says something much more. It says that the individual must regard himself, in part at least, as a means to the good of others. And here we come to the crux of the matter. When I respect the rights of other people, I recognize that they are ends in themselves, that I may not treat them merely as means to my satisfaction. This is widely regarded as the moral thing to do. Why then is it not equally moral to regard myself as an end? Why should I not refuse, out of respect for my own dignity as a moral agent, to regard myself as a means in the service of others?